Alright guys, as you probably got from the title or the intro, today we're going to be talking about generators. Now for the sake of this video, there's two kinds of generators, portable and not portable. Now there are some really big portable generators that can power entire buildings and are on trailers, and there's some small portable generators that still weigh a ton and you wouldn't really want to move them anywhere. But for the most part, we're going to be talking about the smaller campsite or kind of home backup portable generators and the larger home backup fixed install or small like building generators. Now, as far as the portable generators go, there's really two kinds: inverter generators and standard generators. So we're going to start with the standard generator. Now with a standard generator, you've most likely seen these. They're kind of a metal frame with an engine and a large power head. Looks kind of like a motor. But this is what generates the power. This is the stator. Now, these are directly coupled. Essentially, the engine speed is the speed of the armature in the power head. This is what spins and is creating the power. So the RPM of the engine is the RPM of the generator. And this is what produces your power. Now, this is important because the speed of the engine in these is directly related to your power quality and your frequency of your power. In North America, this is 60 hertz. Overseas, it can be 50 hertz. Now, most things in North America are designed to run on 60 hertz. Some kind of computer power supplies and things, switch mode power supplies, are designed to run 50 to 60 hertz. But for the most part, appliances, heaters, air conditioners, these are all designed to run on 60 hertz. This becomes a problem with some of the portable generators. The portable generators are inherently dirty power. A lot of these have a range of about 25% total harmonic distortion. This is kind of the variation that they can have in their power quality. This is an issue because with most electrical grids, so most large power plants, standard thing, you'd have an electric meter and plug into the wall. They're really designed for 3%. That's kind of the range that they try to keep, is 3% power variation. Now, 25%, that's a pretty big deal. If someone was going to pay you something and decided that there was a variation of 25%, you might be pretty unhappy at the result. So are your appliances. When they expect power coming in at 60 hertz and 120 or 240 volts, that's what they're designed to run on. So things can overheat, power supplies could fail, you can run into a lot of issues and possibly cause permanent damage. Now, things are getting more and more computerized. Even refrigerators have computers and Wi-Fi and things in them now. Flat screen TVs and Blu-ray players, streaming players, computers, even air conditioning thermostats, they're all small computers, and they do not like major variations in power. So with a lot of these frame general standard generators, you can run the risk of damaging these, possibly permanently. They produce a dirty power. They're really designed for job sites or, you know, things like kids' moon bounce at a carnival. Things that don't really care about the quality of the power coming into them. They just want the power. Now, on the other hand, you've got something like an inverter generator. An inverter generator works the same way but differently. What this does is it has an engine in it and it has a generator head, but instead of you pulling the AC electricity off of the power head, the generator in here, essentially it is producing AC electricity that is then going to a rectifier and being converted to DC. This DC power then goes to an inverter. Now this inverter is kind of like what you'd expect with the large battery inverters on RVs and campers, or even the smaller ones that you've probably used in your car to power a laptop or a kid's gaming console or something at some point. Now, these computerized inverters can maintain the output of 120 volts, or in some cases 240 volts, and 60 hertz. They can adjust themselves and keep the output very consistent. What this means is that with an inverter generator, they can run the engine at pretty much any speed they want to, as long as it has the horsepower to produce the electricity that the inverter is calling for. This means that you could run the engine at a much lower RPM when you don't need all of the power, and that means that you can reduce the engine noise and the fuel consumption significantly. With a standard generator, you basically have to run it at around 3600 RPM the entire time it's running, whether or not you've got a huge load on it. So this means that it's going to consume a significant amount of fuel, not full fuel, it's not under a huge load necessarily, but the RPM is running more cycles per second. So you're going to use more fuel, generate more noise, and create more wear on the engine. Now, with something like an inverter generator, you have a few trade-offs here. The normal generator is going to be significantly cheaper for the power that you get because it doesn't have as many moving components. There aren't as many things to break. There aren't as many things to make and produce and pack into a neat little case. And this means that overall they're cheaper for the amount of power they put out. Now, the smaller inverter generators usually have a parallel capability, and as you can see behind me over here, I've got a second one, and those connect with something like this parallel box. And this parallel box connects into these parallel inputs, or outputs in this case, and basically ties the inverters together. You start up one inverter and let it kind of warm up and get settled. Then you start up the other one, and the other one syncs its inverter to the one that's already started. So they produce the power simultaneously, essentially doubling your output through the output of this parallel box. Different manufacturers have different ways of doing this. Some connect directly from one to the other and use one set of output ports. It all depends. But for the most part, a lot of inverter generators use these parallel cables with a parallel box. This is great because, as you can see, these are pretty portable. I'm not going to go picking up and moving around a normal like frame generator on wheels. But you can take just one of these and move it around, take it to your campsite, use it for whatever, take it tailgating. Maybe you want to make a margarita or something in the parking lot. I don't know. Or you can take a couple of them in your parallel box and you could even power an entire RV. So for the most part, the power size you're going to get out of these is not going to be the same as a larger generator, but the power quality is going to be significantly better. These can easily run computers and things. The average total harmonic distortion on a lot of these inverter generators is actually around 1%. So that is better than the power company's electrical power coming through your meter to your normal wall outlet. Now, with the outputs on these, normally you've got standard 120 volt outputs on the generator itself, and then with the parallel box here, we've got a 30 amp twist lock, and then a 50 amp Anima 1450 outlet with the corresponding circuit breakers. Now, the 1450 is going to be kind of the standard that you see for larger campers, campsites, and things like that. And the twist lock 30 amp is kind of the smaller end, usually 120 volts only, which is where we get to a problem. The 1450 outlet on larger campers sometimes is, the camper is expecting 240 volts. Now, a lot of them are wired for 120 volts only, but the campsite on a 1450 or any kind of power output of a 1450 you find, that's going to be 240 volts. So when you connect to this, what it does with a 120 volt generator setup is it basically splits the one leg of power output to both of them. This means that if you connect to either one and neutral, you get 120 volts. If you connect between the two legs, L1 and L2, you're going to get nothing. So if you connect this to something expecting 240 volts, you're just going to get 0 voltage. Where this comes into a problem is when you tie it into your house. Now, when you tie something like this into your house through a generator inlet, something like that on the outside, and that's connected with a 50 amp generator inlet or a 30 amp 240 volt generator inlet, one of those, L1, L2, so the red and the black usually, those are going to different bus bars in your main panel, which have the different breakers on them. So by splitting the power to L1 and L2 and having that 120 volts, all of your breakers in the panel do see power. Within reason. Your 240 volt breakers, again, are not going to see 240 volts because they're not out of phase with each other. The problem comes in when you have a 120 volt circuit with a tandem breaker. Now this is done commonly with things like kitchen islands and things where you may have two circuits going to the same place and they just run one wire with 3 conductors and a ground in it. So this can be the red, the black, and the white. The white is your neutral and the black and the red are your 2 hots out of phase. So the black would connect to, say, a 15 or 20 amp circuit on one, and then the red would connect to a 15 or 20 amp circuit on the other. And when each of those is connected to neutral, they are 120 volts. And they have to be on a tandem breaker, so they both shut on and off at the same time. The reason this is because they cancel each other out, so they don't put excessive power on the neutral. The neutral in these wires can't carry any more current than each of the conductors individually. So if you have a 20 amp circuit and you go to neutral, that neutral is also carrying 20 amps. Now, with these circuits, since they're out of phase, the red and the black cancel. So if you have 20 amps on the black, 20 amps on the red, then the neutral actually doesn't see any power at all. If you have 10 on one and 20 on the other, the neutral only sees 10 amps. However, if you split the power coming into your panel between L1 and L2 and run 120 volts into your house, effectively you're just putting the same phase on both and they no longer cancel. What this means is that if you have 20 amps on one and 20 amps on the other, that neutral is carrying 40 amps. And there's a strong possibility that's going to melt, catch fire, and burn your house down. So, for the most part, you do not turn those on. If anything, if you've got a sub-panel or a different kind of generator inlet, don't put those breakers on that transfer switch or that sub-panel at all. Just leave them in your regular panel that can't be run by the generator, and then there's not really any confusion to be had. Now, this brings us to all of the different variations. There are a zillion different ways of connecting these into your house, and so many different kinds of generators that it's unreal. Westinghouse has a couple of new generators that are really nice, 12,000 I think and a 15,000 watt standard generator. So these just have a voltage regulator, nothing special. They're not inverter generators, and yet they maintain under a 5% total harmonic distortion on the power. So these are effectively whole home backup generators, but they can move. I say they can move, not they're portable. They're 300 pounds and have wheels, so you might be able to roll them onto a trailer or something. But these put out 240 volts. They're clean enough for most electricity, most electrical devices in your house, computers, thermostats, high-end refrigerators. They're going to see this, and it's going to be almost the same as the power company's power, and significantly better than the 25% of a lot of generators before. Still not as good as an inverter, but there are inverters that have 240 volt output, and there are inverters that are 7,000, 8,000 plus watts of power. So you can get like 9 to 10 kW generators. You could get 8s, I think, that still parallel, so you could get 16 kW of power from an inverter generator set. This is going to be by far the cleanest power that you're going to get. So that would be 16 kW at like 1% total harmonic distortion. That's going to power pretty much everything in your house and power it better than the power company does. but it's going to be really expensive, and you're going to have to set it up. With something like this guy, as you saw in the intro, you got a little bit of work to do. You've got to put it down, you've got to have your fuel source, you've got to connect all of your cables in, and then you've got to connect it into your house, flip your breakers over, or if you've got a transfer switch and a sub panel, you've got to flip the transfer switch over to your critical loads. That's not much to a lot of people. If your power doesn't go out very frequently, or you like to use your generators for other things like camping, that could be a great way to go. However, if you have disabilities, things that might really need critical power, CPAP machines or air chamber beds that you have to have medically, maybe you can't lift something like this. You can't go out and take care of it. That could be a problem. Also, these are not meant to be used in the rain, which is usually when your power is going to go out. Hurricanes, tornadoes, large storms, that's when your power is going to go out, and it's going to be super windy and pouring down rain. So something like this may be great in days or hours afterward, but not during the initial power outage when you may want it the most to know what's going on. So that is where we come to the installed whole home generators. So I'm going to meet you guys outside another location to talk about those, and I'll see you in just a bit. So what do you do when you aren't comfortable rolling your generator out and plugging in the big power cord, flipping everything over, or if you need power when it's less convenient to do so, such as when the power would probably go out, like a big snowstorm or a hurricane with downpouring rain and high winds. Most of these portable generators aren't meant to get wet, and sticking a tent over it's not going to last very long if it's 125-mile-an-hour winds outside. Well, that's where something like this comes in. This is a 16 kW Generac Guardian. This model is actually discontinued, being replaced with a smaller one and a larger one. But pretty much all of them are about the same. This is an air-cooled generator, so it does not have coolant lines and radiators and things like a car engine does. It's more like an old Volkswagen Beetle in that sense. But essentially, this has a large enough engine that it can maintain a significant amount of power. 16 kW is actually on the smaller side for backup generators. But it sits here on this concrete slab in this pretty little case, which is weather resistant and wind resistant to about 125-mile-an-hour winds. So, what is the benefit of having one of these? Well, this is what it does. Day in, day out, year-round. It sits here and it waits. Doesn't take up space in your garage. It just sits and waits for the power to go out. And when the power does go out, this guy is going to wait just a little bit of time to make sure that it's staying off, and then it's going to start up, go through its self-check, and bring the power back on for the entire house. Now, this is hard plumbed in to a very large propane tank in the ground because this house uses propane for pretty much everything. This is an upside if you're on propane or natural gas with a large enough supply, because it's going to run this thing for quite a long time. It is a downside, however, if, like in my previous videos, you've got issues getting propane to a site, because this is not going to run enough every year if it just runs during power outages that you're going to consume enough fuel that they're going to want to fill the tank and bring one out to the house. But if you've got a hard natural gas connection or a large propane tank for other things in your household, this can be a great way to go to not have to deal with filling and gas cans and everything else. And as a side benefit, this is always there. It is always ready to go, and it's going to start up and take care of everything by itself using an automatic transfer switch, or an ATS, which we'll take a look at in a minute. Now, this generator, being 16 kW, has enough power to power pretty much this entire house. There's a couple of air conditioning units on this one,
and they have devices on them that are known as load shedders. And essentially what they do is they watch the frequency of the generator to make sure that the engine is not struggling. If an engine gets loaded down too much by the generator, the hertz can drop, or the frequency of the AC electricity. And when that happens, the load shedder is going to notice, and it's going to disconnect that load to make sure that you've got enough power for other priority devices in your house. So you set the priority on each of the load shedders as to when it's going to kick off, and then it can just automatically take care of the loads so that the rest of your house can stay powered. This can be a big deal if you've got something that requires power constantly, or if something happens, say, in the middle of the night. Being somewhere without power with things like CPAP machines, or if you've got oxygen concentrators and stuff, could be a big problem. And you may need power, if for nothing else, to keep those running. A side benefit is, if you get a big enough one, you can run your air conditioning, you can run your heating, and all without doing anything. They wait a little bit of time, make sure the power stays off, they kick on, and they just run just like your house is normally on power. Then, when the power outage ends, they're going to run for a little bit longer after that. That's a set time that can be programmed into the units to make sure that the power is staying on and is not just going to blip on and off. And then the generator will shut down and go back into standby mode, waiting for your next power outage. Now, beside me right here is the automatic transfer switch, or ATS. This is a service-rated automatic transfer switch, so this is actually between the main meter coming from the street and the transformer, and in between the power panel on the inside of the house. So whereas normally you would go from your meter into your panel, you're now going through this disconnect, and this disconnect is connected to the generator full-time and has a relay and contactor in here with a bunch of monitoring hardware, and that is on the main service entrance side of the unit. What that's going to do is power is going to constantly be sent to the generator that we looked at that is sitting there waiting for the power to go out. This is going to allow it to use its power, keep running, keep a trickle charge on its starter battery, and make sure that everything is running properly. When this power goes away, that unit is going to sense that the power has gone out, wait the requisite programmed amount of time, and then over its signal wires, it's going to send a signal back to this unit telling it to use the contactor to sever the power from the grid or from the meter. And once it does that, it's going to confirm that is severed, and then it's going to start up the generator and start sending power to this unit right here, which is going to in turn send it into the panel inside the house. Now, the reason that you open this contactor and that it has to make sure that this contactor is in fact, the connection is severed, is so that the generator is not feeding back power through the meter into the grid. As if a lineman were working on something, or out at the street working on what they think is a dead power line, they could end up getting electrocuted by your generator, which has essentially become its own little power plant. So they sever the connection to make sure that no power can be fed out to the street, and then they send the power into your electric panel, all automatically without you knowing anything. So this is about the same as if you were to use a transfer switch in your house or a panel interlock, essentially, where the generator is connected directly into the bus bars of the panel. You have to flip off the main breaker out to the power pole, lift up the interlock, and then you can flip on the breaker into the panel. Except with this one, the generator is always connected, so it's always getting power from the utility, and it severs the connection out at the street so that no power can go back into the electric grid when the generator is running. Now, how does all of this relate to solar and other forms of alternative energy and backup? And the answer is, that depends. Now, if you've got a system like this and you've got solar panels that are only grid tied, you can't use them. This has no way of syncing power to the generator. The generator wouldn't have anything to do with it and wouldn't know what to do. So you don't really want to run a generator to try and make your solar panels think that the electricity grid is on, because there's nowhere for that power to go, and if an appliance suddenly shuts off, you could end up sending power back to the generator, damaging it, and damaging your solar inverter. Now, if you've got something like a battery backup system with your solar, you can create what's called a microgrid, and this microgrid is going to island itself, which essentially is, as you'd think, it's going to sever from the grid, and it is going to make its own little power grid. Now, what this is going to do is it is going to use the battery as a large energy sink for when you have excess power. So if you've got more power coming from your solar panels than things can handle, it's going to go into the batteries. If the batteries are full, it's going to momentarily shut off the solar panels and pull energy from the battery until the battery is depleted enough that you can then keep charging it. If the solar can't keep up and the battery is draining, it can send a signal to something like one of these to fire up the generator and use the generator to recharge the batteries, all while powering your load. Essentially, the battery acts as a buffer. If you don't have something like a battery, you probably can't use a generator with a solar setup. Now, off-grid, you might want to run something like a generator for emergency backup. Again, you're going to need batteries if you've got any kind of solar or anything like that. And if you don't and you're running the generator full-time, it could be expensive. That's where we come to the downsides of things. If you've got something like a 500-gallon in-ground propane tank, and you have a major power outage from a major hurricane or major storm, winter storm, that takes the grid down for over a week, and you're running your entire house, air conditioning and all, or heating, you could end up paying a lot more than you think that you would. An average generator like that 16 kW pulls between 2 and 3 gallons per hour, depending on how much load you're using. If you're running at a half load, around 8 kW, or a full load, and maxing out your generator. Now, what that means is that essentially if you were to run around a half load for an entire week, which, mind you, would be pretty difficult depending on what you're doing and how sized your generator is, but if you're running the air conditioning continuously, it is possible. And if you are doing that, you could drain that 500-gallon tank in a week to a week and a half. And the bill to refill that is going to be somewhere in the ballpark right now of about $2,000. So you have to decide if having power is worth $2,000 for just a week of some air conditioning. Otherwise, you might want to evacuate and go somewhere else. It could end up saving you a lot of money. But for those short-term power outages, or in combination with solar where you don't have to run the generator all the time, you're going to be far, far better off and a lot more comfortable with something like this. For the rest of us, and the people who don't have large in-ground tanks, well, we're left with the small portable guys and a few gas cans, but I don't really have a problem with that.